Welcome everybody. This week we're talking with Slaugh, the farrier who shoes at Oklahoma. And now Kiana will play a short video.
Hold on a second. Okay, take it away.
Perfect.
Here we go.
Me and Lucy will be asking you some questions tonight. And the first one is we'd like to know a little bit about you. So tell us about yourself.
You want Macy to tell him?
I lost the last half of that.
Oh, I said we'd like to know a little bit about yourself. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Okay, I was born in Colorado and raised partly in New Mexico and Colorado. I started shoeing when I lived in New Mexico, although I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, who had been a farrier in the U.S. Cavalry in World War I. And that was kind of my first introduction to farrier work. But then I pursued it later in my life on my own after I came home from Vietnam. I live in Colorado now. That's where I primarily work. I shoe primarily Morgans and saddlebreds. I've been shoeing for 52 years now. I'm a father, a husband, a grandfather, have 8 grandchildren.
And a beautiful wife.
And a beautiful wife, she just said. Maybe I should let her take over and tell you the truth about me.
After 50 years, how much time does she have?
Yeah, right. I've been the farrier for the Morgan Nationals for 35 years. It's been a lot of fun to be able to do that. It's taxing. Sometimes just before the Morgan Nationals, I get this knot in my stomach that says, do you really want to go out there and have all of that tension? But I always seem to go, and I always enjoy the people and the horses. It's a lot of fun. Some of my interests are I like shooting, and as you mentioned, I like to play the bagpipes, and you obviously snagged a picture of me playing the bagpipes. What else do you want to know about me?
Lucy, take it away.
Well, my name is Lucy. Yeah, my name is Lucy. And our next question is, what inspired you to become a farrier?
It was kind of a fluke, really. I came home from Vietnam, and I was going to school at New Mexico State University for a while, and they had a class there. The guy that taught the class had been for the King of Denmark, and I took a class for him and worked under him as an apprentice for a while. And then I just kind of continued doing it, and here I am 52 years later and still love doing it, or 50 years and still love doing it. So that's how I got into it, really. As I mentioned, my grandfather had been a farrier in the U.S. Cavalry, and when I grew up working with him and around him, he would always shoe the horses, and I'd kind of be involved in that. so I was acquainted with it a little bit, but it was only after that that I really started doing it. My interest in the Morgans and Saddlebreds also came as an accident. I was called on the spur of the moment to be the official farrier for a local horse show, and they asked me, can you shoe long-footed horses? And I said, well, when I worked at Oklahoma Farriers College, I did a few of them, and they said, good, get over here. So I went, and little side story, if I'm getting too wordy, let me know. Little side story, there was a fellow here that was a trainer who brought a horse over to me and wanted to know why his horses were nailed so low and what would I do about that. And I said, well, I would pull one nail at a time and redrive them. And he said, good, do it. So I did, and he said, don't go anyplace, I'll be right back. And one after the other, he brought every horse in the barn to me, and I re-nailed all of them. And so then he started telling everybody that I was a genius. And so it was from that I started shoeing Morgans and Saddlebreds, and I'm not a genius, but I did manage to solve his little problem. And so I've been doing Morgans and Saddlebreds ever since. It was June Baker from Moondrift Farm in Fort Collins, Colorado, that had them call me. I don't know if any of you ever met June Baker. She's still alive, but she's quite old. And Moondrift Farm doesn't really exist anymore. So that's about it.
We want to know, what is the most difficult part about being a farrier?
I think probably for most farriers, the most difficult part is the actual business part of it. Most of us spend a lot of time learning how to shoe horses and how to handle horses, and we probably don't do as good a job of handling clients as we should. And I kind of stick that in the business part of it. Most of us are not real good businessmen. We weren't trained to be businessmen. That's one of the failings of farriers' educations, I think, is that there's not enough time spent on how to run a small business. And the other obvious difficulty in being a farrier is just the physical aspect of it. You know, most of us weigh 200 pounds or so, plus or minus, but we're working on animals that weigh 1,000 pounds or more. And so it's a very physical job. And what doesn't meet the eye is when we come out and work at a farm for 8 hours a day or whatever, then we have to jump in our pickups and drive home. We had to also drive there. So we often have long days, and they're very physical. So that, and horses can be very unpredictable. Most of the horses are very nice to be around, but sometimes something that they don't quite get a real good look at scares them. And since they outweigh us, usually we end up on the short end of that stick. But it's a very rewarding profession too. I love the work I do. If I didn't love it, I don't think it would be worth it, because the risk is great. But the horses are wonderful, and most of the people are wonderful as well.
Well, that's great. I loved that answer. So our next question is, what would you say to a young person who's interested in becoming a farrier?
I think probably the first thing I would tell them is welcome. You know, most of us guys that are older, so that you know, I'm 71, and we're kind of looking around at who the next crop of young farriers are going to be. And so I would say welcome to the profession, but I guess my advice to them would be to get all of the education that you can, and I would include not just going to college, but also to work around other farriers and learn from them as much as you can. The longer you work as a farrier, the more you realize how little you know. And I've heard guys say, you know, by the time we finally figure all of this out, we're too old to do it anymore. So I would tell young guys, make sure that you become acquainted with other farriers that are skilled, that are well trained themselves, and learn as much as you can from them. Other countries, namely the UK, has an extensive farrier training program that requires college work and practical work under a master farrier. And they kind of go back and forth. They work for the master farrier for a while, and then they go out and, or they go back to the university and spend time in the university. Then they go back to the master farrier. The program that we have here, well, to be honest, in all of the states that I'm aware of, a guy could read a book and start working as a farrier. We don't have a real requirement for what you have to do to become a farrier. And so guys that want to be farriers need to seek that out on their own. There are some very, very good farrier schools in the United States, but you're not required to go to any of them in order to become a farrier. So young farriers need to seek out education. They need to seek out opportunities to work with other farriers that are skilled. And if they have a particular interest, they need to seek out farriers that excel in those areas. I guess a piece of advice that I would give any young farrier is learn how to say no. There are times when people try to kind of crowd you into doing a horse that when you look at him, you think, he's not liking this a whole lot. And there is a time to say, no, we need to do something else. What else would I tell? My best piece of advice to them would be to learn business skills and learn people skills. One of the things that happens to me all the time at the nationals and at other horse shows is going into the arena to nail a shoe back on. And I think that most people think, well, dumb labor has arrived, you know, just in time to put the shoe back on. But I got to tell you that when I get out in the arena, the rider or the trainer or whoever, they're really upset. You know, they're in the middle of a class, maybe a championship, and they've lost a shoe. And about half of my job when I get out there is to assure them that I'm going to get it back on and everything's going to be okay. And that's a skill that farriers need to develop, not just out in the middle of the show ring, but also in their everyday work, is to relate to their clients and to try to understand what their needs are and try to fulfill those for them.
And piggybacking off of that idea, what would you say the biggest difference is from shoeing at home and then shoeing at horse shows?
Well, one of the things that I often say is that I get to the horse show and I see horses in the arena and I'm looking at these horses and saying, boy, that's really a cute horse. And then I realize it's a horse that I shoe at home. The difference is that I don't see them in their show clothes. I see them, you know, in their barn clothes. And again, one of the things that I've always said is that horse shows are important to me because it's a chance for me to see my horses in the job that they do, and also to see them how they stack up against other horses that are doing their job. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if I went off on a tangent or not. I'm getting
No.
old and drifty, you know.
Perfect.
No, that was great. Our next question kind of has to do with shows as well. And it's, what has been your most memorable experience at a show?
Oh, one of the more memorable experiences was many, many years ago when John Green was a younger man. How many of you know who John Green is? What's Mrs. Green's name that is on the show committee? She wasn't there this year. Anyway.
It's Georgie. Georgie Green.
Georgie, that's right, Georgie. I told you I'm getting drifty because I'm old. Well, John Green is her husband, and many, many years ago, John Green had a horse whose name was Reelin' Big Eddie. And you remember him. Yeah. Well, he was kind of a handful to work on, and he was really a handful in the middle of the arena, and they were showing in a fine harness class, and he ripped a front shoe off. And so I went out to put the shoe back on, and he had torn off a considerable amount of foot with the shoe. And I knew that I didn't really have the time to pull all the nails and try to fish good nails back into his foot. So I just started driving nails through the pads into his foot. And when I started driving the first nail, he just leaped in the air, cart and all. And for some odd reason, when he landed on the ground again, I still had his foot between my legs, and I just continued driving nails. And when I got done, I wrapped his foot up in duct tape and sent him on his way, and he won the championship that time. But after the show was, or the class was over, John came over and he wanted to thank me for getting it back on. And then he said, "But I thought you were crazy because you drove all those nails and you missed all of the nail holes in the shoe," which I did on purpose because I was driving through the pads. And so over the years, every time I see John Green, this year excluded because I didn't see him this year, he'd always come up to me and he'd say, "I always remember that time you put that shoe back on Reelin' Big Eddie." So that's kind of a fun old memory for me. Had a lot of interesting times at the Morgan Nationals.
What would you say is the secret to a well-shod horse?
My secret to a well-shod horse is to do as little to him as possible. The whole shoeing thing really is kind of not a natural thing. How many of us, when we get home, the first thing we do is kick our shoes off? By the way, I told you I have 8 grandchildren. Keeping them with their shoes on is an impossibility. All joking aside, probably the biggest problem that we have with horses is, especially in the show ring, is that they're overshod. And I'm not saying that all horses in the show ring are overshod. I'm saying that oftentimes when we have a problem in the show ring, it's because they're overshod. And so maybe one of the secrets to shoeing a horse is to do just what is necessary to get him to do what he needs to do. Other than that, some of the big secrets of shoeing is learning to balance feet, learning how to match feet, learning how big a shoe needs to be. One of my complaints about horses day in and day out is horses that come to me that I don't know oftentimes are undershod. They have shoes on that are too small, don't give them enough support. And so if there are secrets, one of them is that it takes a while to learn how big a shoe needs to be, not just to cover his foot, but when we add pads to the shoes, we have to also make the shoe bigger. And if a guy, for instance, comes to, say, the Morgan world from, say, the dressage world, most of them very rarely put more than just a thin plastic pad on a shoe. When we're adding thick leather pads and a wedge or something, or maybe multiple leather pads, we're making the foot bigger and bigger, so we have to make the shoe bigger and bigger. And so another one of the secrets is to make sure that we support the foot. There are lots of secrets. The biggest secret of all is learning how to quietly do it, you know, and if the horse gets afraid, then we don't want them to know that, yeah, we're scared too. You know, we need them to know that we're calm and we're competent, and here's what we're going to do, and not spring any surprises on them. Is that a helpful answer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can't share
Yeah.
all your secrets, though.
No, I'd share any secret that I have. We just have a certain amount of time, and not that I'm in a hurry to leave either, you know, but I want to make sure that you're getting answers to your questions that are helpful.
That was very helpful. And you kind of already answered this, but we'll go ahead and ask it. Do you have a breed preference when it comes to shoeing?
A breed preference? Did you say
Yeah,
a breed?
like Morgans versus Saddlebreds, or?
Oh, I love shoeing Morgans.
Yeah.
And you know, years ago, especially out west, there's lots of quarter horses. And I used to shoe so many quarter horses that had feet that were half the size that they should be. And the first time I worked on Morgan horses and some Arabs and saddlebreds was when I realized that not all horses have to have feet that are the size of a dime, you know. And you know, if you look around at cars and various things like that, they have to have tires that support the weight. And horses are no different. They only have a certain amount of bearing surface that bears their weight. And if we have large horses, they need to have feet that are a proper size. And I was drawn to Morgans in particular because they had bigger feet and better feet than the other breeds that I was working on, namely quarter horses and Appaloosas and horses like that. So it is the Morgans that I prefer to work on. I like working on saddlebreds. They're very similar to Morgans, shod roughly the same way. They have a few different rules, but I like working on them. I used to shoe a lot of Arabs. Arabs had a lot of restrictions on them, so that in many cases we couldn't shoe them the way I wanted to shoe them. Namely, they had some weight restrictions that were pretty restrictive, and so I didn't like shoeing them as much, but there were a lot of them around, and now I only shoe a few Arabs, and I don't really shoe any show Arabs at all anymore. I always come back to the Morgans.
Do you have a favorite like Morgan horse or that you've shot and you've watched like compete or not compete that just either is just your favorite to work around or your favorite to watch moving or?
Oh, you mean an individual horse?
Yeah, or like maybe a farm to work for or a cool horse
Oh,
you've shot in the
gosh.
show ring.
Gosh, I've had so many interesting horses to work on. Maybe one of the ones that I recently worked, actually it's not all that recently, started working with this horse a number of years ago, and he's a horse that died over the summer. His name was Meet George Jetson. Some of you probably saw that horse. He was a star, and but he wasn't snooty about it. He was also a barn horse, you know. He was just kind of a buddy to everybody in the barn, you know, and it was always funny to me that when people would walk in the barn, it seems like they would always walk over and say hi to George. And it just happened that his stall was right next to where I worked, and he would mostly spend the day with his head out of his stall, looking around the wall so he could see what I was doing. And interesting, when he was so sick, he was at a big clinic in Denver, actually in Littleton, it's south of Denver. And they had a big sign there in the front of the clinic. There was a big lawn, and they had a big sign there that said, do not graze your horses on the grass in front of the clinic. And the people, the vets and the technicians and clinicians and various people that were there all would say, oh, but George can go out on the grass. And he was just that kind of a horse, you know. Everybody seemed to like him. And I'm telling you, when they had to finally put him down, I think the whole of Littleton Large Animal Clinic were in a state of mourning, as was the barn. So he, even though he's gone, he's a great memory, because he was such a talented horse, and he was so personable. He could be snooty in the horse in the show ring, you know, and really show his stuff. But when he was around the barn, he was just George, and that's kind of a fun memory. There's a lot of those horses like that. Probably none of you will remember now what's his name. It was a horse that Mary Cockrell used to ride many, many years ago. And he was just a really talented horse, and had hardly, he had a keg shoe on the front with a leather pad, and a wore out keg shoe on the hind feet. And he was a star, but he also could be kind of difficult. And with junior riders, he wasn't a horse to get in his mouth very much, and if you did, he would dive in the bit so hard that he would pull the rider right up over his neck. And Mary Cockerell would yell at them, if you pull on him and he pulls back and you end up on top of his pole, does that tell you to stop pulling on him? And you know, he was a horse that taught young riders how to ride with good hands, because if they didn't, he would spring a surprise on them. Why can't I remember his name? Porvenir Bonanza was his name. He's been dead and gone for a lot of years, but he was a remarkable horse. One that, if you ever meet Mary Cockerell and have a chance to talk to her, ask her to tell you about Porvenir Bonanza. Everybody called him Bo. And Mary's got story after story about Bonanza. He was quite a horse.
That's an awesome story. The horses that come out of the show ring and are just the most personable ones are always the best ones. And
They
my final,
are fun, aren't they?
yeah. And my final question for you is, what do you enjoy most about being a farrier? Like, what's your favorite part about doing it?
I think what I like about it is the feeling of creation. Oftentimes, I bet you've never heard that we have some clubby feet in our business. Everybody looks shocked. But when I say the feeling of creation, you know, or the satisfaction of creation, a clubby foot is a good example. A lot of times a horse comes to me and they have two drastically different front feet. One is really clubby and fairly narrow, boxy looking foot. The other one is a big round foot and real low heels, and sometimes a bull-nosed looking foot. And their front legs are just two different legs entirely. And the challenge of making those feet not so much look alike, but to be functionally alike. And all that really means is that when their feet are so different like that, they have a different breakover point on from foot to foot. Oftentimes one knee is higher or lower than the other one. Their shoulder blade is higher or lower than the other one. And the challenge of trying to make that all mechanically similar is fun, especially when you have a horse that high-lows around the ring really bad, and the junior riders and amateur riders have a terrible time posting a trot on them. And by making those 2 feet mechanically more similar, and then to see the difference in how the horse trots and how the rider is able to post a trot, and for them to look more like they're a team rather than enemies, you know. I think that's what I like mostly about it. And working on other breeds of horses, I never really found that interest as much as I do with the Morgans. That doesn't mean that I'm celebrating the fact that we have clubby feet in our job, but it wouldn't matter because all horses have various differences, and the farrier's job is to try to make them as mechanically similar from limb to limb as they can.
I know this is like probably not a good question because I bet you it's different for every single horse, but is like about how long do you think, like on a horse that's uneven and isn't the same on both feet, like how long does that typically take you after multiple times of shoeing them?
Generally, are you talking about just the amount of time it takes me to make those 2 mechanically similar?
Yes.
It's not all that timely because we're dealing with trying to make toe lengths the same and try to make the heel height the same. And I can do that fairly easily, especially since usually when I get to work on them, it's painfully obvious what's wrong. And so I don't really have to experiment a lot. I know some kind of basic rules that I've developed over the years. And so I just go to those rules, and it's kind of a little recipe. It's not anything that I could necessarily write down and say, you know, if this, then do that, you know, or anything like that. But I can kind of look at it and see what the differences are, and then try to make the 2 feet more similar. And oftentimes you have to kind of rob from one and add to the other in order to make it happen. Morgans take a little more time to shoe because we're making shoes and making pads and all of that kind of stuff. You know, guys that I know that shoe quarter horses or dressage horses or stuff like that, they rarely spend more than 45 minutes or so shoeing a horse unless they have a difficult horse. But with the Morgans, normally we'll spend an hour and a half, sometimes a couple of hours working on them because we're trying to make those changes in the horse that comes to us.
That's awesome. And does anybody else who is just here watching and listening have any other questions? Comments, concerns?
I have a comment. You guys are delightful. I've enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you.
You
And thank you
girls.
for coming.
You're welcome. I'm sorry it was such a difficult time getting hooked up.
Oh, no, don't worry about it. Zoom is confusing.
Well, my wife was standing here and she hooks up on Zoom all the time. Even with her help, we had difficulty. So.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you everybody else for being here. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you had fun.